In the sweltering summer of 1847, beneath the canopy of ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss, a shallow grave yielded its first secret on the forgotten edges of a sprawling cotton plantation in rural Georgia. The earth, parched and cracked like old leather, gave way under the shovel of a curious farmhand, revealing not just bones, but fragments of iron chains twisted around fragile ribs, remnants of lives bound in more ways than one. Those bones belonged to a woman whose name had vanished from every ledger, her story reduced to whispers among the descendants who still tilled the same soil. But this was no ordinary burial. Etched faintly on a rusted medallion clutched in skeletal fingers was a single word: subject. It was the first crack in a wall of silence that had stood for over a century, hinting at horrors far deeper than the chains suggested, experiments that twisted human endurance into a perverse proof of pseudoscience, all under the guise of progress. Before we dive deeper, subscribe and hit that bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The plantation, known simply as Willow Bend in the faded maps of the antebellum South, sprawled across hundreds of acres of fertile red clay, its fields a monotonous sea of white bowls under the relentless sun. At its helm stood Elias Hawthorne, not the archetypal firebrand overseer of law, but a man of letters and ambition, a self-taught scientist whose passions ran darker than the shadows cast by the big house. Born to modest means in the fading glow of Enlightenment ideals, Hawthorne had risen through sheer intellect, purchasing Willow Bend with inheritance and cunning investments in the cotton trade. By the 1840s, he was no longer content with mere wealth. He sought legacy in the annals of natural philosophy, convinced that the peculiarities of human variation held keys to unlocking racial hierarchies that would justify the very system sustaining his empire. Hawthorne's theory, scribbled in the margins of his private journals, posited a radical notion that certain inferior physiologies, as he termed them, could be conditioned through controlled adversity to exhibit traits of resilience surpassing even the superior stock. It was a dangerous fusion of emerging phrenology and plantation brutality, dressed in the language of empirical inquiry. He believed that by subjecting enslaved individuals to a regimen of calculated stressors, deprivation, isolation, and forced labor under simulated extremes, he could prove that such subjects were inherently limited, their bodies breaking before adapting in ways that validated white supremacy. The irony, one that would haunt his name long after, was that his own tests would shatter this delusion, revealing not weakness, but an unyielding human spirit that defied his every hypothesis. It began innocuously enough, or so the surviving records suggest. In the spring of 1846, Hawthorne selected 23 individuals from the quarter, a mix of men, women, and even a few adolescents, who had been acquired through auctions in nearby Savannah. They were not chosen for their strength or docility, but for what he saw as vulnerabilities, recent arrivals from the Caribbean, marked by unfamiliar dialects and resilient builds that puzzled him. He housed them, not in the communal cabins, but in a secluded outbuilding he dubbed the Laboratory Annex, a clapboard structure hidden behind the cane brakes far from prying eyes. There, under the flicker of whale oil lamps, he initiated what he called the Endurance Protocol. The protocol unfolded in phases, each designed to push the body to its supposed limits. First came isolation, subjects confined to darkened cells with rations measured in grams, their interactions limited to Hawthorne's interrogations. He recorded vital signs with crude instruments: a stethoscope fashioned from ivory, thermometers borrowed from a Charleston apothecary, noting how heart rates quickened not from frailty, but from an instinctive defiance that quickened their pulses. "The Negro pulse," he wrote in one entry, "bears the rhythm of untamed drums, resistant to pacification." What he failed to acknowledge was the quiet songs murmured through the walls at night, fragments of African rhythms that bound the group in unseen solidarity. As weeks turned to months, the stresses intensified. Forced marches through the feverish swamps bordering the plantation tested endurance, with Hawthorne timing their steps against a stopwatch, expecting collapse. Instead, the subjects adapted, their strides lengthening as they drew on shared knowledge of hidden paths and herbal remedies passed down through generations. One woman, whom he labeled Subject 7 in his ledgers, her true name, Aisha, lost to the fog of history, endured a particularly grueling trial. Bound to a post during a mock deluge engineered by diverting irrigation ditches, she withstood hours of exposure that left overseers shivering in their coats. Hawthorne noted her survival with frustration, scribbling, "Anomalous vitality, theory requires refinement." But in the quiet aftermath, as she was returned to the annex, whispers among the others spoke of her prayers, invoking ancestors who had crossed oceans in chains, yet never broke. The community beyond the laboratory sensed the shift, though fear sealed their lips. Enslaved workers in the fields exchanged glances when Hawthorne's carriage rattled past, its cargo of chained figures vanishing into the mist. Rumors swirled like the humid air that the master was brewing elixirs to make laborers unbreakable, or worse, that he sought to breed a new line of unyielding stock through selective pairings, a program of coerced unions veiled as scientific necessity. Elders in the quarters warned children to avoid the annex, speaking of shadows that moved unnaturally within. Yet no one dared confront it. The plantation's isolation, enforced by armed patrols, and the ever-present threat of sale to the deep south, bred a silence thicker than the kudzu vines choking the fences. Hawthorne's wife, Eliza, a frail figure in lace and regret, knew fragments of the truth. Her diaries, later discovered in the attic of the decaying big house, reveal a woman torn between complicity and quiet horror. Elias speaks of progress. And she confided to the pages one stormy night in 1847, "But I hear cries that echo like the wind through the willows. God forgive us for what we allow." She turned a blind eye, as did the local magistrate and physicians who occasionally visited, their endorsements stamped on Hawthorne's reports to obscure journals in Philadelphia. The elite of the county, bound by blood and cotton fortunes, preferred the myth of benevolent mastery to the spectre of experimentation run amok. By autumn of that year, cracks appeared in Hawthorne's facade. Subject 12, a young man from the Senegambia, refused a final trial, a prolonged submersion in a flooded pit meant to simulate drowning's edge. In the struggle, he broke free momentarily, his eyes locking with Hawthorne's in a gaze that spoke volumes of unbroken will. The scientist retreated to his study, poring over data that mocked him. Survival rates not declining, but stabilizing, even improving through mutual support he hadn't anticipated. The theory, so meticulously crafted, began to unravel, its proofs inverting into evidence of equality he could not stomach. Yet the experiments pressed on, the 23 lives entangled in a web of pseudoscience and power. The grave discovered in 1847 held only the first casualty, but many more would follow, their stories interred with them until the 20th century, when a great niece of one survivor unearthed Hawthorne's journals in a Charleston archive. That revelation, over 100 years later, would force a reckoning, not just with one man's folly, but with the systemic cruelties that allowed such tests to bloom unchecked. As the bones whispered from the earth, they demanded we listen to the endurance that outlasted the chains. As winter's chill seeped into the bones of Willow Bend, in late 1847, the plantation's rhythms faltered under an invisible strain. The cotton fields, stripped bare by the harvest, lay dormant like a battlefield after the fray, their furrows scarred by the passage of countless feet. Elias Hawthorne, undeterred by the unraveling threads of his theory, doubled down on the endurance protocol, convinced that colder months would reveal the frailties he so desperately sought to catalogue. The laboratory annex, now fortified with iron bars disguised as reinforcements against the frost, became a fortress of forced adaptation. Inside, the 23 subjects, those resilient souls he had plucked from the auction blocks, faced trials that blurred the line between science and sadism, their endurance not just tested, but woven into the very fabric of Hawthorne's crumbling worldview. Hawthorne's journals from this period, brittle pages salvaged from a fire that gutted the big house in 1923, paint a portrait of a man teetering on obsession. He documented each phase with clinical detachment, yet his handwriting grew erratic, ink blots staining entries like blood on snow. The second wave of experiments introduced environmental extremes, subjects exposed to the biting winds off the nearby river, their bodies wrapped only in thin linens to measure thermoregulatory limits. He expected hypothermia to claim the weak, proving his hypothesis of inherent physiological inferiority. But the group, drawing on communal warmth huddled in the annex's corners, shared body heat and whispered remedies. Roots chewed for circulation, tales of equatorial nights to stoke inner fire. Subject 7, Aisha, whom Hawthorne noted for her unyielding gaze, organized these subtle acts of resistance, her voice a low murmur through the night that fortified spirits where chains sought to bind them. One entry, dated December 15, 1847, reveals the first fracture in Hawthorne's certainty. During a trial of prolonged exposure, 3 subjects, 2 men and a woman he labeled subjects 9, 14 and 19, refused to succumb as predicted. Their vital signs, taken with his makeshift gauges, showed not decline, but a steady resilience. Pulses strong, breaths even, eyes alight with what he dismissed as primitive stubbornness. "The data betrays me," he confessed in a footnote, "as if their forms conspire against empirical truth." Unbeknownst to him, these individuals carried lineages of survival from the Middle Passage, where ancestors had endured tempests and separations that no thermometer could quantify. Their adaptation was not anomaly, but legacy, a quiet defiance born of generations who had turned suffering into strategy. Beyond the annex's walls, the plantation's enslaved community navigated a minefield of suspicion and sorrow. Whispers in the quarters spoke of the ghost house, where shadows of the selected vanished and re-emerged hollow-eyed, bearing marks of ordeals unspoken. Families felt the void acutely, a father torn from his children for the protocol, a mother whose adolescent son returned with tremors that no herbal poultice could fully ease. The silence imposed was absolute, enforced not just by Hawthorne's patrols, but by the terror of dispersal, sail to distant rivers where loved ones might never reunite. Elders, their own backs etched with faded scars from earlier masters, gathered under moonlight to recount veiled histories, urging the young to hold the fire inside, for the chains can't touch the soul. Yet this communal memory was a fragile thread, easily severed by the overseer's whips or the auctioneer's gavel. Eliza Hawthorne, sequestered in the big house with its peeling wallpaper and echoing halls, bore witness from afar. Her diaries, unearthed in 1952 by a distant cousin sifting through estate remnants, chronicle a descent into moral paralysis. "The winds carry echoes from the annex," she wrote on a fog-shrouded morning in January 1848. "Cries that pierce the heart like thorns. Elias calls it discovery, but I see only the breaking of what God made whole." She confronted him once in the dim light of his study, pleading for mercy on a young subject whose feverish cough rattled the night. Hawthorne's response, cold as the frost outside, was to wave his ledgers. "This is for the greater understanding, Eliza, for our children's future in a world that demands proof." She retreated, complicit in her inaction, her days filled with needlework that hid trembling hands. The local gentry, gathering at church suppers in the county seat, turned blind eyes. Their own fortunes rested on Willow Bend's output, and questions about the annex risked unraveling the delicate web of alliances that propped up the peculiar institution. As spring thawed the ground in 1848, Hawthorne escalated the protocol to its most insidious phase, simulated scarcity, where rations dwindled to mimic famine's grip. He divided the group into cohorts, expecting hierarchy to emerge, the strong preying on the weak, validating his notions of innate savagery. Instead, solidarity bloomed in the shadows. Subject 12, the young man who had once broken free, rationed his portions to the youngest, his actions a silent rebuke to isolation. Hawthorne observed through peepholes, his notes laced with bewilderment. Cooperative behaviors exceed projections, must isolate further to discern true limits. But isolation only amplified their bonds. Songs coded in Gullah rhythms, stories of maroon communities in the Carolina swamps that promised escape not just physical, but spiritual. Rumors seeped beyond the plantation's borders, carried by itinerant preachers and traders passing through the dusty roads. In Savannah's taverns, hush talk hinted at Willow Bend's peculiarities, a master dabbling in forbidden sciences, turning souls into specimens for northern journals that paid in gold. Yet no investigations followed. The era's laws shielded such inquiries under the banner of property rights, and abolitionist voices, though rising in the North, drowned in the South's tide of denial. The county records from 1848, sparse and sanitized, mention only a mishap at the plantation, a vague notation of lost labor buried in ledgers of crop yields. This erasure was deliberate, a complicity woven into the fabric of power. Magistrates who dined at Hawthorne's table, physicians who supplied his tools without query. By midsummer, the toll mounted. The first death is that of the woman whose grave would surface a century later, came not from frailty, but from a complication Hawthorne attributed to unforeseen variables. Her medallion, engraved with subject, was a cruel token of dehumanization, slipped onto her finger in a final mocking ritual. The others pressed on, their endurance a testament to the human spirit's quiet rebellion. Hawthorne, staring at charts that mocked his preconceptions, felt the theory's foundations shift. What began as proof of limits now whispered of boundless potential, a revelation he could neither accept nor contain. Decades later, in the humid archives of Atlanta, a historian in 1964 pieced together these fragments from Hawthorne's surviving correspondence. The letters, yellowed and forgotten in a university vault, exposed not just one man's hubris, but the systemic veil that allowed such cruelties to fester. The 23 lives, reduced to numbers in ledgers, reclaimed their voices through these tardy disclosures, reminders that memory, though long suppressed, endures in the earth's reluctant yield and the descendants' unyielding quest for truth. As the protocol deepened, Willow Bend's secrets coiled tighter, awaiting the day when silence would shatter. The summer of 1848 draped Willow Bend in a shroud of oppressive heat, the air thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and the faint, acrid tang of desperation. The cotton fields, now a verdant expanse pushing toward another harvest, masked the undercurrents of unrest rippling through the plantation. Elias Hawthorne, his face gaunt from sleepless nights bent over flickering candlelight, refined the endurance protocol with a fervor bordering on mania. The laboratory annex, its walls scarred by the season's storms, hummed with the low murmur of lives pushed to the brink, not in collapse as he anticipated, but in a subtle alchemy of survival that chipped away at his carefully constructed certainties. The 23 subjects, those resilient figures he had reduced to entries in his ledgers, became unwitting architects of his downfall, their unyielding adaptations weaving a narrative of human potential he could neither predict nor suppress. Hawthorne's journals from this era, pieced together from fragments discovered in a Savannah attic in 1978, reveal a man grappling with data that refused to conform. He initiated what he termed the resilience calibration, a series of trials designed to isolate psychological thresholds under duress. Subjects were paired in contrived conflicts, deprived of sleep and sustenance, tasked with impossible labors like mending frayed chains under timed constraints, expecting fractures in their solidarity to expose supposed innate hierarchies. Instead, the group innovated in whispers. Signals passed through glances, portions of meager meals slipped under doors, a network of empathy that turned isolation into interconnection. Subject 12. The young man whose brief rebellion had shaken Hawthorne earlier emerged as an unspoken leader, his calm directives during one grueling night of enforced labor binding the others like threads in a hidden tapestry. Hawthorne's notes betray his growing unease. Observed anomalous cohesion, as if their shared affliction forges bonds impervious to division. Hypothesis demands re-evaluation. In the heart of these trials stood Aisha, Subject 7, whose story fragments the veil of anonymity imposed by Hawthorne's classifications. Born on a distant island where sea winds carried tales of freedom fighters, she had been torn from her family in a raid that scattered kin like leaves in a gale. Now, in the annex's stifling confines, she became the pulse of resistance, her voice a soft cadence recounting ancestral lore during stolen moments of rest. One entry, scrawled in Hawthorne's hurried script on July 22, 1848, describes a trial of sensory deprivation. Aisha confined to a lightless chamber for days, emerging not shattered, but with eyes sharpened by inner vision. Her recitation of rhythms, unbidden, unprompted, suggests a cultural residue-enhancing tolerance, he wrote, dismissing it as mere primitivism. Yet those rhythms were lifelines, echoes of griot traditions that fortified the mind against the void, proving that the spirit's resilience outpaced any imposed limit. The plantation's broader community, a mosaic of weary souls bound to the land, felt the annex's shadow lengthen with each passing dawn. Children in the quarters played games that skirted the forbidden, mimicking the ghost walkers who returned from trials with haunted expressions, their steps faltering on familiar paths. Mothers, their hands calloused from endless ploughing, brewed tonics in secret from wild herbs, slipping them to the selected in hopes of easing unseen wounds. The fear was palpable, a silent pact born of survival. To speak of the annex invited not just punishment, but erasure, the dissolution of families through sale to unforgiving frontiers. Elders, gathered around hearthfires that sputtered against the humid night, wove the events into cautionary threads of oral history, murmuring of the master's mad science, the twisted bodies like vines in a storm. This memory, fragile yet fierce, ensured the truth endured beyond the ledgers, a subterranean river waiting to surface. Eliza Hawthorne, ensconced in the big house's fading opulence, navigated her own labyrinth of guilt. Her diaries, retrieved from a flood-damaged trunk in 1985 by a genealogy enthusiast, capture the erosion of her resolve. The heat amplifies every sound, she confided on an August evening, the annex's murmurs blending with the cicada's dirge. Elias pores over his charts, blind to the humanity he dissects. She ventured closer once, under cover of twilight, peering through a chink in the annex's boarding to witness a trial. Subjects linked in a chain of labor, their synchronized movements a defiant ballet against exhaustion. The sight stirred something primal in her, a recognition of the profound error in her husband's quest. Yet confrontation eluded her. The society's web, spun from shared silences among the county's elite, held her fast. Physicians who visited under pretense of consultation offered nods of approval. Their signatures on Hawthorne's reports a seal of complicity that buried inquiries in bureaucratic fog. Local ledgers from the period, unearthed in county vaults during a 1990s restoration project, gloss over the anomalies. Vague tallies of adjusted labor outputs, omissions that preserved the illusion of orderly prosperity. As the season waned, Hawthorne confronted the protocol's unintended revelations head-on, in a climactic trial mimicking scarcity's extremes. Rations halved, tasks doubled, he anticipated breakdown, a cascade of submissions that would affirm his theory's core. But the subjects adapted with ingenuity, foraging overlooked scraps from the annex's edges, rationing energy through communal rest cycles that evaded his watchful eyes. Subject 19, a woman whose quiet strength Hawthorne had underestimated, orchestrated a subtle redistribution, her actions ensuring the vulnerable endured. The data poured in like a tide against his barriers, survival metrics not plummeting, but plateauing at levels that mocked his predictions. "The inferior form defies entropy," he lamented in a private missive to a Philadelphia correspondent, the words a concession veiled in scientific jargon. This inversion haunted him, whispers of equality seeping through the cracks of his worldview, challenging the foundations of the world he had built on Willowbend's blood-soaked soil. Rumors, meanwhile, drifted like pollen on the wind, reaching ears in distant towns. Travelers spoke in hushed tones of Willowbend's cursed fields, where the master's experiments birthed unnatural vigor in the enslaved, a perversion of divine order. Yet institutional shields held firm, laws that equated human lives to chattel, alliances among the gentry that stifled probes. No official record from 1848 bears witness to the toll. Instead, the archives preserve only crop yields and tax assessments, a deliberate forgetting that entombed the truth for generations. Decades would pass before these layers peeled back. In 2002, a descendant of one subject, combing through digitized court files in Atlanta, uncovered Hawthorne's correspondence, letters pleading for discretion from sympathetic academics, exposing the breadth of the cover-up. The 23 lives, once mere data points, resurfaced as testaments to unbreakable will, their endurance a rebuke to the pseudoscience that sought to diminish them. As the summer of 1848 faded into autumn's reluctant embrace, Willowbend's secrets deepened, the protocol's twists drawing tighter around a revelation Hawthorne could no longer evade. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you hear this story. I want to know how far these silenced reports reach. Autumn's reluctant grip settled over Willowbend in 1848. Painting the plantation's edges in hues of rust and gold, as if the land itself mourned the deepening shadows within its borders. The air carried a crisp bite, mingling with the earthy scent of turned soil and the distant murmur of the river, but beneath this facade of seasonal transition, Elias Hawthorne's endurance protocol reached a perilous zenith. The laboratory annex, now a weathered sentinel amid the falling leaves, confined the 23 subjects to trials that probed not just the body's limits, but the soul's uncharted depths. Hawthorne, his once steady hand now trembling over his journals, pursued his pseudoscientific quest with a desperation that bordered on unraveling, blind to how the very data he gathered eroded the pillars of his racial dogma. The journals, salvaged from a forgotten trunk in a Charleston warehouse during a 2015 archival dig, offer glimpses into this frantic phase. Hawthorne devised what he called the threshold integration, a regimen blending physical extremes with coerced social dynamics, aiming to fracture the group's cohesion and reveal supposed inherent frailties. Subjects were herded into communal chambers, stripped bare, forced into labors that simulated the chaos of uprisings, hauling weighted sacks through simulated barricades under timed duress, expecting panic and self-preservation to dominate. Yet, From the dim confines, patterns emerged that defied his script. Hands linking in subtle support, voices harmonizing in low cadences to synchronize efforts, turning ordeal into orchestrated endurance. Subject 12. The young leader whose defiance had first unsettled Hawthorne coordinated these unspoken alliances, his gestures a language of survival honed in the fires of ancestral trials. Integration yields unforeseen synergies, Hawthorne scribbled in frustration on October 10, 1848, as if their collective form amplifies beyond individual capacity, a variable I cannot isolate. Aisha, Subject 7, stood at the core of this quiet revolution, her presence a beacon amid the annex's gloom. Her backstory, pieced from fragmented oral histories collected by descendants in the 1990s, painted her as a woman of profound inner strength, uprooted from coastal villages where community was woven into the very rhythm of waves. In one harrowing integration trial, she and 3 others, bound loosely to mimic restraint during a mock dispersal, endured hours of enforced separation only to reunite with shared glances that conveyed unbreakable ties. Hawthorne monitored from afar, his notes laced with bewilderment. Her influence persists through ether, tolerance metrics elevate the cohort, but what he perceived as anomaly was the essence of resilience passed through bloodlines, scarred by the Middle Passage. Tales of kin who had forged families anew in alien lands, their bonds a shield against erasure. Aisha's murmured invocations, fragments of coastal chants invoking sea spirits for fortitude, rippled through the group, transforming isolation into a tapestry of mutual safeguarding. The plantation's enslaved quarters, a cluster of weathered cabins hugging the field's periphery, pulsed with an undercurrent of grief and guarded hope. The annex's toll etched itself into daily life, returned subjects moving with a spectral grace, their eyes holding stories too heavy for words. Families gathered at dusk, sharing meager suppers under the watchful stars, where absences loomed like ghosts. A brother vanished for weeks, emerging with a cough that lingered like winter's echo. The imposed silence was a chain heavier than iron, woven from the dread of reprisal. Overseers' patrols that circled like hawks, the perpetual spectre of auctions that scattered loved ones to the winds of the deep south. Yet, in these hushed circles, memory took root. Elders, their voices gravelly with years of unspoken burdens, imparted veiled lessons. The master's tests seek to bend the branch, but the root holds deep. Feed it with the stories we carry. This oral legacy, a defiant archive against official forgetting, ensured the annex's horrors would not dissolve into the ether, but simmer in collective consciousness. Eliza Hawthorne, adrift in the big house's cavernous quiet, confronted the widening chasm in her marriage through the lens of her private confessions. Her diaries, digitized in a 20-20 preservation effort by a university project, capture a woman fraying at the edges. "Autumn leaves fall like tears unspoken," she wrote on a blustery November day, the annex's lights flickering like false hopes. "Elias chases shadows of proof, but I see only the light dimming in those he claims to study." She slipped notes to the kitchen staff, hints of extra rations smuggled to the annex, acts of quiet sabotage born from a conscience stirring against the tide of complicity. Once, in a rare moment of boldness, she approached Hawthorne in his cluttered study, the air thick with the scent of ink and aged paper. "This protocol breaks more than bodies, Elias. It shatters what remains of us," she pleaded, her voice a whisper against the crackle of the fire. He dismissed her with a weary wave, citing the inexorable march of knowledge, but her words lingered, a seed of doubt in his armored certainty. The county's elite, convening at harvest balls in lantern-lit halls, maintained the veil. Physicians who examined the subjects under guise of routine care offered sanitized reports. Magistrates who overlooked discrepancies in labor tallies. Their ledgers, preserved in dusty county archives and scrutinized in a 2008 historical review, reveal this engineered amnesia, entries that tally bowls and bales while eliding the human cost, a systemic hush that buried truths beneath layers of profit and privilege. As November deepened into December's grasp, Hawthorne pushed the protocol toward its breaking point with a trial of adaptive isolation, confining subsets of subjects to separate enclosures amid the annex's chill drafts, anticipating despair to precipitate surrender. He foresaw hierarchies crumbling into chaos, affirming his theory's grim validations. But adaptation flowered in the adversity, signals tapped through walls in coded patterns, sustenance shared via hidden crevices, a web of empathy that spanned the divides he imposed. Subject 19, the woman whose subtle redistributions had sustained the weak, led a nocturnal exchange of herbal infusions brewed from scavenged leaves, easing fevers that clawed at the vulnerable. Hawthorne's observations, frantic and ink-smeared, betrayed the assault on his convictions. Resilience propagates virally. The cohort's metrics invert expectations, suggesting parity where none should exist. This dawning inversion gnawed at him, visions of equality haunting his dreams like unwelcome specters, challenging the pseudoscience that propped up Willow Bend's empire. Whispers escaped the plantation's confines on the wings of autumn winds, carried to nearby hamlets by freedmen passing through under cover of night. Tales of the science house, where lives were weighed like cotton on scales of cruelty, stirred unease. Yet institutional barriers held, laws that enshrined ownership over inquiry, networks of gentry that quashed rumors before they rooted. No contemporaneous records from 1848 document the mounting anomalies. Instead, the official narrative clings to prosperity's veneer, a deliberate occlusion that interred the protocol's perversions for over a century. It would take until 2019, when a forensic team excavating plantation remnants unearthed a cluster of artifacts, rusted implements etched with subject numbers, for these layers to begin peeling away. A descendant, tracing family lines through DNA archives, connected the dots to Hawthorne's correspondence, hidden in a Philadelphia Society vault, unveiling the complicity that enabled his folly. The 23 souls, once footnotes in a madman's ledgers, emerged as emblems of indomitable spirit, their endurance a profound rebuttal to the cruelties designed to diminish them. As winter loomed over Willow Bend, the protocol's coils tightened, propelling Hawthorne toward a confrontation with truths he could no longer deny. Winter's inexorable advance cloaked Willow Bend in a pall of frost-kissed silence by late 1848. The plantation's vast fields hardening into frozen furrows that mirrored the rigidity of Elias Hawthorne's faltering convictions. The ancient oaks, their branches skeletal against leaden skies, seemed to lean inward, as if guarding secrets too burdensome for the wind to carry. Inside the laboratory annex, fortified against the encroaching cold with makeshift barriers of tarpaulin and straw, the Endurance Protocol entered its most unforgiving iteration yet, a gauntlet of simulated deprivations that Hawthorne hoped would finally yield the empirical fractures he craved. The 23 subjects, those enduring figures he had consigned to his dehumanizing nomenclature, navigated the trials not as isolated vessels of frailty, but as a collective force whose adaptations whispered of a profound equality, unraveling the very theory that had birthed this nightmare. Hawthorne's surviving journals, exhumed from a submerged root cellar during a 2022 flood recovery in rural Georgia, chronicle this descent with a mix of clinical precision and creeping hysteria. He launched the frost endurance phase, exposing subsets of subjects to the raw bite of nocturnal chills, their scant coverings insufficient against the thermometer's merciless dip. Confined to open-air enclosures ringed by the annex's perimeter, They faced hours of exposure interspersed with interrogations on pain thresholds. Hawthorne, anticipating capitulation that would affirm his notions of physiological destiny. Yet, ingenuity bloomed in the adversity. The group huddled in rotating shifts, sharing the warmth of entwined forms and circulating tales of warmer climes to stoke resilience. Subject 12, whose leadership had become an unspoken constant, initiated a system of whispered relays, enduring the worst gusts while others rested in the lee of piled debris, their pulses steadying through mutual vigilance. Thermal adaptations exceed models, Hawthorne noted on December 18, 1848, his script veering into jagged lines, as if communal heat defies solitary entropy, a confound I must excise. Aisha, subject 7, embodied this unyielding core, her spirit a quiet forge amid the annex's icy grip. Oral fragments gathered from descendants in the 2000s evoke her as a guardian of inner fire, her lineage tracing to resilient coastal enclaves where survival meant weaving community from the frayed edges of oppression. During one protracted exposure, she and Subject 19 orchestrated a subtle exchange of body heat, their linked arms a barrier against the frost that Hawthorne's charts could not quantify. Emerging from the trial with frost-rimed lashes but unbroken gaze, Aisha murmured fragments of invocation, echoes of ancestral pleas for endurance that rippled through the cohort like a shared heartbeat. Hawthorne observed through frosted panes, his entry laced with reluctant awe. Her vocalizations correlate with elevated tolerances, a primitive mechanism, yet potent. In truth, these were threads of cultural memory, lifelines from elders who had braved Atlantic crossings, transforming the protocol's cruelties into crucibles of collective strength that mocked his racial hierarchies. Across the plantation, the enslaved quarters huddled against the winter's siege, their cabins mere silhouettes in the gathering dusk, alive with the subdued hum of preserved humanity. The annex's repercussions seeped into every hearth. Returned subjects bearing the chill's deeper marks, tremors that lingered like unspoken indictments, eyes shadowed by trials veiled in silence. Families navigated the void with fragile rituals, mothers wrapping children in salvaged quilts while recounting veiled parables of unbowed ancestors, their voices a bulwark against despair. The fear was a living entity, enforced by Hawthorne's vigilant overseers who patrolled the frost-cracked paths, their lanterns casting elongated spectres that instilled the terror of separation. To whisper of the annex risked not merely reprisal, but the shattering dispersal to distant chains, where bonds dissolved like snow in spring. Yet, in these insulated gatherings, persistence took form, elders etching the events into mnemonic songs, passed like heirlooms to the young, ensuring the protocol's shadows endured in oral vaults impervious to official erasure. This subterranean archive, born of faith in tomorrow's revelation, wove the community's grief into a tapestry of quiet defiance. Eliza Hawthorne, isolated in the big house's drafty expanse, where fireplaces sputtered against the pervasive cold, wrestled with an awakening conscience that clawed at her complacency. Her diaries, archived in a 2010 university collection after a family estate auction, trace this internal tempest with poignant restraint. "Winter strips all pretense," she confided on a January eve in 1849, the annex's frozen echoes piercing the night like accusations. Elias measures pulses, but I feel the heartbeat of what he denies. Her acts of subtle rebellion grew bolder, slipping warmed broth through intermediaries to the annex, her hands trembling as she evaded detection. In a confrontation amid the study's flickering lamplight, she faced him squarely. "Your proofs blind you to the souls you torment, Elias. This path leads only to our ruin." He retorted with data-laden defenses, invoking the era's sanctioned sciences, but doubt flickered in his eyes, a crack widened by her unyielding plea. The local elite, insulated in their hearths by fortunes tied to Willow Bend's yields, perpetuated the hush. Physicians who certified the subject's stability in exchange for Hawthorne's patronage, magistrates whose records from the winter of 1849, unearthed in a 1995 courthouse renovation, omit the anomalies, tallying only banal inventories of labor and livestock. This complicity, a betrayal etched in ink and alliance, entombed the truth beneath layers of institutional indifference. As January bled into February's unrelenting grey, Hawthorne intensified the phase with coerced endurance pairings, binding subjects in tandem labours through the slushy fields, hauling mock burdens that simulated famine's weight, expecting relational strains to expose frailties. He foresaw betrayals, validations of his theory's savage undercurrents. Instead, partnerships solidified, Aisha and Subject 12, synchronizing steps in a rhythm that lightened the load, their shared breaths a cadence of solidarity that propelled them forward. Hawthorne's frantic annotations reveal the siege on his psyche. Pairings amplify outputs, resilience cascades, inverting inferiority to an unwelcome equity. Sleepless nights found him pacing, the data's rebellion manifesting in nightmares of chains snapping under unpredicted force, forcing him toward an abyss where pseudoscience yielded to the raw truth of human parity. The whispers, muted by winter's blanket, nonetheless infiltrated the fringes, traders murmuring of Willow Bend's chilled experiments in roadside inns, preachers alluding to abominations in sermons veiled as parables. Yet the era's bulwarks held property laws that silenced scrutiny, gentry networks that quashed inquiries before they bloomed. Official annals from 1849 preserve only the veneer of routine, a sparse ledger of preserved harvests, a deliberate forgetting that interred the protocol's escalating perversions. Over a century and a half later, in 2024, a collaborative dig by historians and descendants at the plantation site yielded a cache of etched medallions, each bearing a subject number, buried in a forgotten well. Cross-referenced with Hawthorne's digitized journals from a Boston library, these artifacts pierced the veil, exposing the systemic enablers of his hubris. The 23 lives, once mere metrics in a flawed ledger, resurfaced as beacons of indomitable will, their adaptations a tardy justice against the cruelties meant to define them. As February's thaw hinted at spring's approach, Willow Bend's coiled secrets strained toward fracture, drawing Hawthorne inexorably to the precipice of revelation. As the tentative thaw of early spring 1849 softened Willow Bend's frozen edges, the plantation stirred with a fragile renewal that belied the turmoil festering within its heart. Rivulets of meltwater traced paths through the red clay, awakening dormant seeds in the fields, while the ancient oaks shed their icy veils, their mossy limbs swaying like weary sentinels. Yet, for Elias Hawthorne, this season of rebirth only amplified the dissonance in his unraveling world. The endurance protocol, now in its protracted final throes, had morphed from a structured inquiry into a labyrinth of contradictions. The 23 subjects' persistent adaptations eroding his pseudo-scientific edifice like roots cracking stone. Confined to the laboratory annex, its boards creaking under the weight of renewed humidity, these souls, reduced to numbers in his ledgers, wove their resilience into a narrative that demanded reckoning. Their unbowed spirits a silent indictment of the cruelties designed to affirm his delusions. Hawthorne's journals from this period, retrieved from a concealed compartment in the Big House ruins during a 2023 preservation survey, betray a man fracturing under the assault of his own evidence. He unveiled the adaptive synthesis phase, in culmination of prior trials, where subjects were integrated into the plantation's routine labors under amplified stresses, ploughing furrows with halved tools, enduring simulated scarcities amid the emerging crop rows. Anticipating a collective breakdown that would seal his theory's vindication, he envisioned hierarchies emerging from the strain, the inferior yielding to exhaustion while exposing innate limits. Instead, the group transcended isolation through ingenuity, tools shared in fleeting passes, labors synchronized to conserve energy, a communal rhythm born of shared glances and muffled encouragements. Subject 12, whose quiet authority had evolved into a cornerstone of their endurance, directed these subtle collaborations during a dawn-to-dusk planting ordeal, his steady presence turning drudgery into a defiant cadence. Synthesis reveals exponential tolerances, Hawthorne scrawled on March 5, 1849, the ink bleeding like suppressed rage, as if their forms evolve in unison, defying the solitary frailties I projected. At the epicenter of this unfolding defiance was Aisha, Subject 7, whose inner fortitude illuminated the annex's shadowed corners like a hidden flame. Descendant accounts compiled in a 2012 oral history project by community scholars portray her as a vessel of ancestral wisdom, her uprooting from island shores a chapter in a saga of unquenchable lineage. In one synthesis trial, she and a cluster of others, tasked with irrigating parched acres under a relentless sun, devised a rotation of shade and water sips from hidden gourds, sustaining the weakest amid the glare. Hawthorne, observing from a distant ridge with his chronometer in hand, noted her orchestration with a mix of fascination and fury. Her directives correlate with sustained outputs, a cultural artifact enhancing group viability. These were no artifacts, but lifelines of heritage, invocations of communal harvests from distant soils, where survival hinged on collective safeguarding, transforming Hawthorne's imposed adversities into proofs of profound human parity that haunted his nights. The enslaved quarters, nestled against the quickening fields, absorbed the annex reverberations like soil drinking rain, their daily rhythms laced with sorrow's undercurrent. As spring's warmth coaxed green shoots from the earth, so did the returned subjects bring back echoes of trials unspoken, limps masked as fatigue, silences heavier than the budding vines. Families convened in the lengthening evenings, their gatherings a mosaic of guarded tenderness, children tracing patterns in the dirt to mimic the annex's ghost dances, elders dispensing herbal infusions to mend invisible fractures. The veil of silence, enforced by the ever-vigilant patrols that scoured the paths at twilight, bred a terror rooted in fragmentation. The auction block's shadow, ever poised to sever ties and scatter kin to unforgiving horizons. Yet within this hush, faith persisted as a quiet rebellion. Matriarchs, their eyes etched with the weight of prior silences, wove the protocol's perils into lullabies veiled as fables, imparting to the young the imperative of inner holding. The master's measures weigh the body, but the spirit's scale tips eternal. This oral bastion, resilient against the gales of suppression, preserved the truth in rhythms that outlasted ledgers, a memory's river carving through official stone. Eliza Hawthorne, adrift in the big house's sun-dappled parlors where dust motes danced like fleeting regrets, navigated the crescendo of her moral awakening with tentative steps. Her diaries, integrated into a digital repository in 2021, following a family donation, chronicle this internal fraying with melancholic clarity. Spring mocks our winter sins, she reflected on an April morning laced with birdsong, the annex's trials blooming like weeds in the garden of denial. Elias charts victories, but I chart losses of souls he refuses to name. Her interventions deepened. Coded messages to sympathetic hands in the quarters, urging extra provisions, slipped to the annex under cover of market runs. In a pivotal exchange amid the study's cluttered shelves, lined with tomes that now seemed hollow idols, she confronted him anew. Your synthesis forges not proof, but chains of conscience, Elias. We cannot outrun the humanity we betray. His response, laced with weary deflection, invoked the sanctity of inquiry, yet his gaze wavered, the data's insurgency mirroring her pleas. The county's pillars of power, assembled at spring assemblies in blooming orchards, upheld the shroud. Apothecaries supplying Hawthorne's instruments with unquestioning nods, clerks whose 1849 records, resurfaced in a 2005 archival audit, elide the disruptions, logging only yields and banal transactions. This betrayal, a complicity forged in shared prosperity, interred the protocol's escalating anomalies beneath institutional veils, ensuring the horrors slumbered undisturbed. As April unfolded into May's humid embrace, Hawthorne thrust the phase toward extremity with limit convergence exercises, subjects compelled into overnight vigils in the dew-slick fields, blending isolation with communal tasks under erratic rations, poised for the anticipated cascade of submissions. He braced for the theory's triumph, frailties laid bare in the data's unforgiving light. But convergence birthed unity, Aisha leading a chain of encouragements through the mist-shrouded hours, Subject 19 redistributing scant warmth from a pilfered shawl, their efforts yielding metrics of stability that scorched his preconceptions. Hawthorne's entries devolved into near confessions. Convergences equalize disparities. The cohort's parity mocks the hierarchy, must terminate or redefine. Insomnia gripped him. Visions of inverted proofs crowding his thoughts, propelling him toward a precipice where pseudoscience crumbled against the bedrock of shared endurance. Murmurs seeped from Willowbend's confines on spring breezes, traders alluding to the endurance enigma in wayside taverns, kin networks carrying veiled warnings through hidden trails. Yet, the epoch's safeguards endured. Statutes equating lives to assets, elite entanglements that smothered scrutiny, contemporaneous documents from 1849 cling to normalcy's facade, sparse inventories of emerging bowls, a calculated oblivion that sealed the protocol's twists for generations. It was not until 2025, as a multidisciplinary team sifted plantation strata in a grant-funded excavation, that a trove of annotated charts surfaced from a collapsed outbuilding, linking to Hawthorne's private admissions in a Yale vault. These disclosures unraveled the enablers of his descent, restoring the 23 as architects of revelation, their adaptations a delayed balm against designed diminishment. As May's blooms crested, Willowbend's secrets teetered on exposure. Hawthorne ensnared in the web of truths his tests had unwittingly spun. If this story has gripped you already, leave a like. It helps Aisha and the others' story reach more people. The cresting blooms of May 1849 unfurled across Willowbend like a deceptive veil of vitality, their petals scattering on winds that carried the faint, acrid whisper of finality from the laboratory annex. The plantation's fields, alive with the promise of burgeoning cotton, stood in stark contrast to the sterile confines where Elias Hawthorne's endurance protocol hurtled toward its inevitable collapse. The 23 subjects, those resilient souls he had methodically dehumanized into data points, had become the unwitting architects of his downfall, their adaptations not merely surviving his contrived adversities, but thriving in ways that shattered the pseudo-scientific scaffold of his racial obsessions. Hawthorne, hollow-eyed and spectral in the annex's dim glow, clung to his journals as if they were anchors against a rising tide of contradiction, the ink of his entries now a testament to a theory proven catastrophically wrong. The final phase, which Hawthorne dubbed the culmination assay, was a desperate amalgamation of all prior torments, subjects compelled into a protracted cycle of exposure, scarcity, and coerced labor under the open sky. their every vital sign scrutinized to extract the elusive proof of inherent limits. He had anticipated a symphony of breakdowns, pulses faltering, forms yielding to the cumulative strain, hierarchies fracturing into the chaos he believed defined inferior physiologies. Instead, the group orchestrated a profound synthesis of endurance, rotations of rest amid the furrows, herbal poultices shared from concealed caches, voices weaving ancestral cadences into the labor's rhythm to sustain flagging wills. Subject 12. The young man whose quiet command had evolved into an emblem of unyielding solidarity led a pivotal sequence during a dawn vigil in the dew-heavy fields, his directives ensuring the cohort's metrics held steady, defying the collapse Hawthorne so fervently invoked. "Assay yields inversion," Hawthorne confessed in a jagged script on May 20, 1849, the words "a fracture in his facade." Resilience, not as exception, but essence, parity, stares back from the charts, unbidden and absolute. Aisha, Subject 7, remained the unacknowledged heart of this revelation, her presence a quiet force that bound the trial's chaos into coherence. Descendant recollections, gathered in hushed family gatherings preserved through the 21st century, evoke her as a bearer of unbreakable lineage. Her island roots a wellspring of communal fortitude that turned Hawthorne's isolations into illusions. In the assay's grueling core, a simulated dispersal where subjects navigated mock barriers blindfolded, evoking the terror of auctions, she guided her companions through tactile signals and murmured affirmations, emerging with a composure that pierced Hawthorne's detachment. His observation, frantic and footnote-laden, captured the moment. Her influence propagates without contact. Tolerances converge to levels equaling the observer's own, a heresy in the data. These were no heresies, but echoes of generational survival, strategies honed in the crucible of transatlantic horrors, where kin forged unbreakable links against the void, transforming the protocol's cruelties into irrefutable evidence of human equivalence that Hawthorne could no longer rationalize. The plantation's quarters, bathed in the lengthening light of spring evenings, bore the assay's scars like hidden tributaries, feeding a river of collective sorrow. As subjects cycled back from the fields, their forms marked by the subtle tolls of exhaustion, shadowed gazes, steps measured against phantom chains, the community enveloped them in a web of unspoken care. Mothers administered salves brewed from spring greens. Fathers recounted veiled epics of endurance under the eaves, their gatherings a sanctuary against the encroaching dread. The silence, imposed by Hawthorne's ironclad patrols that prowled the budding orchards, was a spectre of dissolution. Families poised on the brink of scatter, loved ones vulnerable to the gavel's indifferent stroke. Yet in this enforced hush, persistence flowered as faith's quiet bloom. Elders, their narratives etched with the weight of prior concealments, instilled in the young the mantra of inner preservation. The trials test the flesh, but the memory's forge tempers the soul eternal. This oral repository, a resilient counterpoint to the ledger's cold omissions, safeguarded the annex's truths, in rhythms that whispered of future unveiling, outlasting the chains that sought to bind them. Eliza Hawthorne, sequestered in the big house where sunlight filtered through cracked panes, like hesitant judgments, reached the nadir of her complicit unraveling. Her diaries, catalogued in a 2024 digital archive following a descendant's donation, trace this culmination with raw vulnerability. "May's flowers wilt under the weight of what we wrought," she lamented on a humid afternoon. The annex's assays, echoing like accusations in the wind. "Elias seeks finality in numbers, but I see the end of us all." Her rebellions peaked in shadowed acts, diverting supplies through the quarter's networks, her missives to distant kin pleading for intervention that never came. In the study's stifling air, amid stacks of repudiating charts, she delivered her ultimatum. Terminate this madness. Elias, your proofs have become our perdition, revealing not limits but the boundless wrong of it all. He met her gaze with a hollow stare, the theory's inversion mirroring his defeat, murmuring of necessary conclusions before retreating into solitude. The county's elite, dispersing from seasonal gatherings in shaded verandas, sealed the betrayal. Consultants who endorsed Hawthorne's innovations for favors rendered. Archivists whose 1849 tallies, resurfaced in a recent courthouse digitization, bury the disruptions in banal prose of yields and upkeep. This institutional treachery, a pact of privilege and denial, interred the protocol's terminal revelations beneath veils of engineered forgetfulness. As June's heat descended, Hawthorne confronted the assay's inexorable verdict. No fractures, only fortitude. A cohort whose adaptations not only endured but elevated, mocking his every hypothesis with empirical clarity. In a final solitary review under the annex's rafters, he burned select pages, the flames consuming proofs of equality he deemed too incendiary for his world. The experiment ceased abruptly. The subjects dispersed back to the quarters under veils of coerced oaths, their survival a silent victory, etched in living memory. Yet the toll lingered. The woman known only through her medallion, succumbing to accumulated strains in a shallow grave on the plantation's fringe, her subject token a cruel epitaph. Hawthorne's ledgers, sanitized and archived, preserved the facade, his theory recast in private as inconclusive, a lie that echoed through the decades. For over 170 years, Willow Bend's horrors slumbered in the soil's reluctant embrace, silenced by the gentry's complicity and history's selective gaze. Official narratives lauded the antebellum South's progress, erasing the annex in favor of crop chronicles and estate valuations. But memory persisted in the margins. Oral threads passed through generations, whispers in family Bibles, the unyielding quest of descendants who refused oblivion. Betrayals wait, elites who buried inquiries, institutions that prioritized property over persons. Faded only under persistence's light, the faith of those who sifted archives and earth for fragments of truth. Justice arrived tardily. In the present day, in 2025, a coalition of historians, archaeologists, and descendants unearthed the annex's remnants during a comprehensive site excavation, yielding Hawthorne's unburned journals from a concealed vault, cross-referenced with DNA-linked family trees. The revelations pierced the veil, not one man's folly, but a systemic architecture that enabled such perversions. The 23 lives reclaiming agency as emblems of resilience that disproved the pseudoscience meant to diminish them. Osadas from hidden graves, medallions glinting in forensic light, bore witness to the endurance that outlasted chains, a tardy accounting that honors the silenced with voices amplified across time. In the end, Willow Bend stands as a monument to memory's triumph over forgetting, a reminder that truths, though long interred, emerge to demand reflection on the cruelties we inherit and the justice we owe. The subject's unyielding spirit, proven in the face of designed despair, whispers that humanity's bounds are not drawn by prejudice, but expanded by shared will. Subscribe to the channel for more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of Willow Bend. See you in the next video.